Hello everyone, this is James from Teresa's Soundworld Alternative Music blog. There we are. And today I'm doing a video article about an album by a band called High Low. The album is called Cyclops, and here it is on vinyl. There we go. Now High Low are an alternative rock band from Southend-on-Sea in England. Now, before I start talking about the band and this album, I'd like to talk about the artwork really, because I'm very guilty of this, and I know other reviewers are. We focus on the music and sometimes we overlook the artwork and the design of albums. And unless you're something like this, Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, or rather this side, it tends to get overlooked a little. So I thought I'd talk about the artwork. So for Cyclops, we're not on the dark side of the moon at all. We're on the light side, and we're in the Earthlight with this classic car here, and these two peculiar characters in their very natty late 50s cut suits. And they reminded me of those henchmen in the Alfred Hitchcock film North by Northwest, who abduct Cary Grant's Roger Thornhill. And they're under the impression that he's this mysterious character, George Kaplan. So I don't know whether or not that's a reference to that. But also looking closer, these characters also have these gumball Cyclops eyes. And I wondered if it was a reference to the musical enigmas that are the Residents. But anyway, moving on then to the band themselves. So High Low, listening to this album, immediately I thought that the production, although it was very modern in its delivery, also had some analog lo-fi feels to it as well. It put me in mind of Guided by Voices, and if you know that alternative rock band from the US, Guided by Voices started their career as a very lo-fi band using analog equipment and having a very fuzzy sound. But I believe that with High Low, they kind of combine analog sounds with something a bit more contemporary, a bit more digital, and it's a nice middle ground. It's like a hybrid sound. So Guided by Voices sprung to mind. Also, in musical style, Guided by Voices would have sometimes an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar combined, and with High Low, the first track of the album, you actually get an acoustic guitar and this wall of fuzz guitar, and it's just a really nice sound. I also thought of other alternative rock bands as I started exploring the album a bit more, thinking of from the US Built to Spill, who were still soldiering on, and also Pavement. Those bands sprung to mind, but also bands who have stood the distance but sort of run as a parallel to the grunge movement, to the Seattle grunge movement of the late 80s and early 90s. So I'm thinking about bands like Dinosaur Jr. and the kind of off project of that once Lou Barlow had left Sebado. I'm also thinking about Mudhoney. Some of High Low's bass lines remind me of those chunky bluesy bass lines that Mudhoney would deliver in their early 90s album, Piece of Cake. It's that kind of era. It's quite melodic as well. And from that era, from that early 90s era, I also thought of Sugar, which was Bob Mould from Husker Du's band in the early 90s. Like Husker Du, very melodic, and High Low remind me of his band. In terms of production, going back to that as well, some of it, although not in terms of vocal delivery, I'd like to stress to add, but in terms of the whole aesthetic, you can hear elements of Galaxy 500 as well. Sticking on the US side of things, I started to think a bit more about the punkier tones, the noisier tones of this album. And I was thinking of bands like Gaunt, who didn't really fit into punk. They didn't fit into indie. They certainly didn't fit into grunge. And I think High Low have that kind of mystique about them where they have lots of influences, but it's a really nice melting pot. A bit like Gaunt, really. But as you moved on into the 90s, in the US as grunge started to die out, really, with the death of Kurt Cobain. You started getting pop-influenced alternative rock bands who were creating tunes that were accessible more in the mainstream, more than a lot of grunge music. If you think about bands like Soundgarden, what they were doing in the early 90s was probably not as commercial as their later offerings. But the bands I'm talking about that had this sort of pop, punk, alternative rock influence, bands like the Fountains of Wayne I was thinking of, and the Lilies, and although they're not my favourite band, Weezer. This is the thing with reviews. If you hear a band and you think they've got an influence, just because you're not too keen on a band, it doesn't mean that you discount them. So I think that they have that influence of Weezer. I was also thinking about what was going on the other side of the Atlantic over here at the time, and I was thinking with High Low, there's certainly a feel of the fuzzier Britpop elements, more like Supergrass really than Oasis. It's like that kind of punk influenced, sloppier, sort of fuzzier sound. And also Blur's American alternative rock ventures in the late 90s, from their album in 1997, I was thinking there's sort of elements of that as well. There's surfier moments with High Low, and it again combined with an alternative rock sound. The obvious go-to would be the Pixies, but I think there's something a bit more to it, really. There's sounds maybe of Manor Man and Dick Dale himself, the surf genius. You've got little hints of that, perhaps. There's also some 70s sounding indie, and what I mean by that is not indie from the 70s like The Fool, but bands like Teenage Fan Club, where they had those influences from classic rock and pushed it into their music. And there is that kind of Teenage Fan Club feel, that very melodic, radio-friendly feel in High Low's music. But also on the flip side, there's noisier elements, and I was thinking of 90s bands as diverse as Uresi Yatsura and the Peccadillos, where there was just big walls of noise and lots of interesting ideas going on. So I think that High Low do venture away from sort of a poppier sound and go experimental at times. And that also makes me think as well of what was going on in the UK at the time. So you had Britpop, you had bands like I've just mentioned who were noisier and more creative, but you also had pop punk bands who were functioning at the same time as bands like Green Day and Blink-182. But I'm not saying that High Low sound at all like those bands, but over here you had indie punk bands, so they were more British sounding indie guitar, but influenced by punk bands, influenced by skate bands. I'm thinking of bands that are either functioning at some capacity or back, or just completely gone. So I'm thinking about bands like Midget and Ash and Symposium. And I think that High Low have that kind of pop punk feel as well. Sometimes as well, I think of more grander bands when I've been listening to High Low, so I'm thinking of Smashing Pumpkins and Foo Fighters as well. But anyway, this band are on most listening platforms. You can access them on Bandcamp, where you can buy physical copies of this album, although from what I can gather, the copies are selling out quite fast. So you can listen to digital copies there. There's also Spotify and Apple, iTunes, which I tend to favour. But anyway, what I'm doing to accompany this article is something called What's He Talking About Now? And that's just a companion playlist on my YouTube channel where, first of all, you get a track by the band I've reviewed, so a track by High Low, and then any bands I've mentioned who connect to this band, or who I think are influences or inspirations or little hints that have subconsciously got into the music, I kind of include them in a playlist. And what I'm going to be doing in the future as well, if I mention anything like pop culture references like North by Northwest and you think, what the hell is he talking about? I'm going to see if I can put little references into that as well. So if you're watching on Facebook, there will be a link to this album, the Bandcamp album. There'll also be a link tree, which if people have seen that, I'm sure you have, of this band as well. And that kind of gets you to all their music and all their social media. And also I have a link to the Teresa's Sound World YouTube channel with the playlist. If you're on Instagram, you'll have to click on the high-low IG profile. I'll make that very clear. You'll go through to their profile and you can click on their link tree there. But anyway, I hope you go and have a listen to High Low. They are a 90s influenced band who take inspiration from anything from Britpop to US alternative rock, British indie pop punk, and also they have a good sense of melody, musicianship, songwriting, and something to say about their songs as well. They're quite short, but I absolutely, in the words of Jello Biafra, but from the Dead Kennedys, I like short songs. So it's a great snappy album to listen to. So check them out. Visit one of the streaming profiles that are in one of the links, and I hope you enjoy their album, High Low, Cyclops. I've been James from Teresa's Sound World Alternative Music blog. Cheers for now.